Greetings, everyone, and welcome to City Lights Live, the online edition of the City Lights Booksellers events calendar. I'm your host, Peter Maravellis, and tonight, City Lights celebrates the life and work of one of the most important figures in the history of the American labor movement. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn was involved in almost every major campaign for social justice in the first two-thirds of the 20th century. She was an outstanding orator, writer, tactician, and politico, devoting her life to the advancement of civil liberties. City Lights and Rutgers University Press are pleased to be celebrating the publication of the new book, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, The Rebel Girl, Democracy and Revolution. It's by Anne Trasciatti and is published by Rutgers University Press. We are honored to have with us tonight the book's author, Anne Trasciatti, in conversation with Naomi R. Williams. As always, we are beaming to you from the unceded ancestral homeland of the Ramaytush Ohlone peoples. It is a privilege and an honor to do so. Anne Trasciatti is a professor of rhetoric and the director of labor studies at Hofstra University in Hempstead, New York. She co-edited the collections Where Are the Workers? Labor's Stories at Museums and Historic Sites, and Talking to the Girls, intimate and political essays on the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. Naomi R. Williams is associate professor of labor studies and employment relations at Rutgers University. Their primary research interests include labor and working class history, urban history and politics, gender and women, race and politics, and more broadly, social and economic movements of working people. They are the author of A Blueprint for Worker Solidarity, Class Politics and Community in Wisconsin, which is published by University of Illinois Press. So please join us now in offering a warm welcome to Anne Trasciatti and Naomi R. Williams. It is a great pleasure and an honor to have you both with us tonight. Welcome to City Lights.
Thank you, Peter. Thanks for having us. Thanks to City Lights Books. And thanks, Naomi. It's such a pleasure to be here talking with you.
Indeed. Thank you, Peter. Thank you, City Lights. And thank you, Marianne. It's an honor to be here talking with you today. And this is a very timely book, really a great book. I'm just gonna hold it up here. Because I have my copy, put the cover back on after I finish reading it. And it's just it's a great, well-written, well-researched biography and an important history of really demonstrating what a worker activist should be and what kind of life someone like that can live. So I'm going to ask you first off the bat, tell us why you decided to write another biography.
Yeah, so yeah, this is not the first biography of Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. So I first learned about Flynn when I was a graduate student. So several years ago, I read a speech that she gave after the 1913 Patterson Silk Strike, and I thought, wow, this woman's really cool. How come I don't know anything about her? And so I went and read everything I could find, and there's Words on Fire, a collection of her speeches and writings by Roz Baxendale, the late Roz Baxendale, and that was really terrific. And then there are a couple of other biographies, and I was able, through reading those things, to get a sense of Flynn's words, what she said, what she wrote, a sense of her personality, a sense of her personal life, her commitments, some information about the political work, the labor work that she did. But the story always felt kind of disjointed to me. And some of the things that I found out in my own research that I thought were really important that she had done really were missing from that story. And so I wanted to make a contribution to our understanding of Flynn, because I do think she's a really underappreciated and really key figure in the U.S. labor movement, but also in the civil liberties movement. And that was really what I honed in on. Flynn was an extraordinary labor organizer. She was a rebel, right? Her nickname was the Rebel Girl. She was also called the East Side Joan of Arc, daughter of the Reds. And when she was older, she was called things like a fat slob and a communist battle axe. So, we're not very kind to, we like older, young, we like younger, attractive activists, not so much older women. But even when she wasn't a girl, she was always a rebel, right? She rebelled against the exploitation of working people. She rebelled against sexism, though she didn't call herself a feminist. She rebelled against racial discrimination, in part because of her principles, but also because she was Irish. And her Irishness really figures prominently in this book for me as well. And that's something that was missing in some of the other accounts. She rebelled against colonialism and imperialism, fascism. And again, a lot of this was rooted in her Irishness. She grew up with stories of the Irish freedom struggle, and that really steeled her determination to make common cause with exploited people, really around the globe. And so, I wanted to tell that story centering her contribution to civil liberties because that really is a thread that connects everything. It was a force that impacted her life, and it really was something that she started her career as a soapbox speaker, ended it as a leader of the Communist Party, but she really never relinquished her commitment to fighting for the rights of everyone, really, to speak, to write, to assemble as they chose, and should they to get into trouble for that, to be tried fairly by a jury of their peers. So I really wanted to move her, now that the Cold War is over too, I really wanted to move her back into the center of labor history and civil liberties history.
Indeed. And, I think probably what stood out for me is that the theme throughout the book and throughout her life and her work that you really highlight in the book, right, is this need for all people to have access, right? Have access to democracy and practical democracy, right? So the ability to have a conversation with their like-minded peers on street corners and to make decisions about how it is to have safety at work and to work under humane conditions. And the idea that people were more important than property, more important than the work itself. And those themes that she continued to go back to in all of these different fights in, local, national, international, really seemed to center around her love of, or her sense of justice. I should say that, her sense of justice and this practical democracy.
Yeah, so Flynn was so the title of the book is Rebel Girl, Democracy and Revolution. I think I touched a little bit on the rebel part, right? And I want to add also that she's a US born rebel.
Right.
She was born in Concord, New Hampshire, and that matters, right? Because she is part of a US left socialist tradition that has been here almost from the very beginning. It is, it is not un-American to advocate for the rights of working people. It is not un-American to advocate for those rights as a socialist. There is a really rich US left tradition, and Flynn is part of that. I think very often in this country, we try to, we vilify anybody who engages in class politics as un-American, as if somehow, we don't have that kind of political tradition here. And in fact, we do. And so and Flynn always embraced um, her Americanness, along with her Irishness and her socialism, right? She was an Irish
Right.
American, and that mattered to her. She embraced the tradition, the revolutionary tradition of the United States, and she defended the First Amendment of the Constitution throughout her life. And that life was really rich. And she started as a socialist when she was a teenager. She then became a member of the IWW, a Wobbly. And for people who maybe aren't familiar with the Wobblies, that was a union founded in Chicago in 1905. And it's an industrial union, right? So organizing all workers in all industries into one big union, unlike the American Federation of Labor, which was really concerned with skilled workers, mostly white guys. The Wobblies organize, and who knows why they were called that. There's some theories, but the IWW or Wobblies, if you were white, black, male, female, Asian, Latino, itinerant, stationary, immigrant, American born, they would organize you. And Flynn did some of her most important civil liberties work as an IWW. She started out in Missoula, Montana, and Spokane, Washington, standing on soapboxes on street corners in these communities where local politicians would and align themselves with business leaders, and they would pass laws to make it illegal for anyone to give a speech outside with a pro-labor message. If it was the Salvation Army, politicians, whatever, right? Things non-threatening to the status quo was fine. But if you were trying to organize workers, especially as the IWW was doing, migratory workers, lumber workers, miners, whatever, you would get, pulled off the soapbox and thrown in jail. And so Flynn did some of her earliest civil liberties work there, pioneering some of the tactics that actually came to be associated with the free speech fight, sending a bunch of speakers out on multiple street corners at one time, calling for reinforcements so that you'd have all these hobos, all these itinerant workers pouring into places like Missoula and Spokane, getting up on the soapbox, reading the Declaration of Independence and getting thrown in prison. The goal was, we'll clog the jails, we'll embarrass the city, and eventually they'll relent. And that did happen in Spokane and Missoula, and to some extent also in Paterson, New Jersey, though there not so many hobos, a much more stationary force. But that was important to Flynn, right? That working people in these communities had just as much right as the Salvation Army, as politicians, as anyone, to speak, to organize, to claim space. And the great thing about soapboxing is you don't have to draw people into a hall or find a time that works. You go out and you speak where people are. You go to them, right? And that's exactly what
Right.
the IWW did. And
And some of, oh, I'm
go
sorry.
ahead.
No, I didn't mean to interrupt you. My apologies.
No, it's okay. Well, just to add, one of the really cool things about these free speech fights is that they launched conversations about what is the First Amendment, what is the Constitution for, what is free speech, who's entitled to these rights all over the country. So you have like miners and mill workers and lumber workers and factory workers, of garment workers, textile workers of every ethnicity debating these issues. It's called popular constitutionalism. So it not only empowered like the people who were directly involved, like, hey, we get to speak, we get to represent our interests, we have the right to do that. But it also got people all over the country, working class people, really feeling invested, right,
Right.
in this notion of civil liberties, in the actual, not just the idea, but the practice of free speech. And so it was really great. And she continued to do that work. She founded, along with Roger Baldwin and others, the American Civil Liberties Union in the 1920s. Actually, in 1920, she got kicked out in 1940 for being a communist. We can talk about that, but she continued to advocate while she was a member of the ACLU, to advocate for workers who had been imprisoned under the Espionage Act passed during World War I, and any worker of any, trade unionist, socialist, anarchist, communist, any labor activists. So people like Eugene Debs, Sacco and Vanzetti, Emma Goldman, Schenck of the Schenck versus the United States, the case that established the clear and present danger test for speech. She was an advocate for Schenck. And then when she became a communist, she joined in the 30s during the Popular Front period. She continued to, she spoke out against fascism, and also continued to advocate for people's rights to hold whatever political opinions they wanted, and to join with like-minded people in nonviolent organizations, really until for the rest of her life. The very last thing she ever advocated for was the right to travel when her passport was revoked because she was a
Yeah.
communist. She and Herbert Aptheker sued the United States and won. And so now, we can all travel freely, whatever our political ideologies, because of Flynn. The piece she wrote was really, really beautiful. It's called "The Borders Are My Prisons," and how, if you limit travel, you actually limit the possibility for people, to expand their minds. So that's really important work.
It's very important work. I'm gonna go back to those free speech fights in Montana and Missoula, in particular, and the calling in reinforcements
Hmm.
and loading the jails. And so, reading the the press pieces in your book and the snippets from her text, right? Encouraging folks and really making it workers' responsibility, right? To show up and to fill the spots. And it was right. You know, I think it was Spokane, but also in Missoula as well. Like people didn't even need to have a speech. They just needed to be prepared to stand there and, like you said, read from the Declaration of Independence. And those ideas to me really remind me of this conversation that we continue to have about immigrant workers, right? And who gets to be a worker and who gets to have a voice in these public debates. And so to me, it was really fascinating to think about all of the folks who did have access to this information that they wouldn't have had otherwise, and to see their workplace struggle, right? They're trying to get shorter hours at work and more pay, and to that was not separate from their access to how do I get to become an American citizen? How do I get to engage in this political right of citizenship? Right. And so to see that play out in the early 20th century reminds us of why we have to protect workers, regardless of who they are, and to the right to work and to the right to work in safe and conditions, right? And to advocate for themselves together. There was there are a couple of points that you continue to make in those first chapters on free speech. Was the fact that the workers themselves and their issues often took a back seat to the political debate around access to public spaces and the criminalization, right? The criminalization of talking in public, talking on street corners with your friends, with your colleagues, with like-minded folks. And so this contest of who owns the space, and it's the people. And that constant struggle, it's the people, over and over again. And so it's a conversation I want to have about like what's happening right now and kind of lessons that we can take from this and from Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's ability to move across constituencies, if you will, and just have conversations with different folks. So what worked out west didn't necessarily work in New Jersey, right? And it was because of the longer history of labor organizing in New Jersey. But I think there were some beautiful things that did work, right? So continuing to fight for the public space was huge, and finding a place to meet when they were no longer allowed to hold meetings in the city halls. And so then they go to the Bottle House, which is now the American Labor Museum, right? Here for the folks who are coming to Central Jersey, you can go check it out. But just the idea that, every 20,000 people in the backyard of,
Yeah.
and to be able to have those conversations together and to, right, own it, to own the space, to march there and back, right? During the silk worker strike in Paterson. And so to see how she very skillfully, right, very skillfully used the local conditions and what the workers wanted. So when you look at the press, and I think this is something that really comes out in the book, when you look at how people are writing about what she's doing and writing about the strikes and the worker mobilizations that are happening, right? They often miss what started it all, right? What was the intent? What were the workers fighting for? And she's like, no, we got to go back to what this strike is about. Why is nobody talking about the poor working conditions, the fact that we have these children, putting up with these types of conditions? And so it was really, to me, very impressive the way that she used the what was happening in the local space and made
Mhm.
that a part of all of her speeches, all of her activism, all of, what do you want? The organizing of, okay, who's the strike committee, who gets to make the decisions? Like, and it wasn't the Wobblies, right? It wasn't the IWW. It was actually the workers themselves, and then the IWW were presenting their information. And it's really a valuable lesson for people who are attempting to organize workers today, right? You have to understand what's going on in those local factories and the working and living conditions in the cities where people are, and the workers there in those particular spaces, right? They have they have the knowledge of what's happening, and they know what they need. They know what their wins are. And so, we talk about Patterson as a loss, and like the strike failed, but they won so much.
Yeah. Yeah. You raise a lot of interesting things. One of the things, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn grew up in poverty. So they moved from New Hampshire to the Bronx, Massachusetts, other places. And she grew up in poverty and saw a lot of poverty around her. And her politics then, her labor politics, her socialist politics were really rooted in those experiences, hearing stories about, people that she didn't directly encounter, hearing stories about the Irish freedom struggle and, how England had its heel, the boot on the neck of the Irish and that kind of exploitation, but also seeing this stuff directly. So her politics really emerged from concrete things, concrete experiences and stories about like people's lives and her witnessing of people's lives and her own life. And this idea that, people, the many should not have to suffer so that the few can prosper, right? And she took that kind of grounded in, material conditions, a frame and applied it to everything she did. So,
Right.
she fought for free speech, how she stood on a soapbox and spoke and encouraged other people to stand on a soapbox and speak. And it was a very direct action approach. The best way, right, to claim to protect your right to speak is to find the space and then speak from it. She did that out west, and it was a little bit harder in Paterson, New Jersey, because she couldn't call a bunch of hobos in to, I mean, these were all workers who lived there and could be blacklisted, and many of them were. Um,
Right.
but even then, it was, we're being limited. So we need to find a hall. We need to find a corner. We need to, and she was always very clear too that one really important mode of expression. I mean, speaking was one, right? Organizing, firing people up, but striking and picketing, right? That picketing was not a protected form of speech at that time in the 19 teens, right? Not until actually till the New Deal. So, and the point of picketing, it is, of course, to express like, oh, hey, we're here on strike, but it's also to keep scabs out of the factories, right? To keep people, to grind things to a halt. So again, a
Yeah.
very concrete approach. So I think that it's important to acknowledge that her approach to obviously to labor organizing, picketing, and but also to free speech was not a liberal approach. This isn't a matter of individual rights. It's not a theoretical, abstract thing. Free speech, free press, free assembly, a fair trial, these are necessary preconditions for working class organizing, right?
Exactly.
There's an imbalance of power in our society, an imbalance of wealth. There are haves and have-nots. And the only way that the have-nots can really push back, right? And claim what is rightfully theirs, bread and roses, right? Better wages, but also the nicer things in life, is to be able to or collectively engage in action. It's kind of like collective bargaining, right? Like that's the whole principle behind unions is I can negotiate with my boss individually, but together, right? Since the boss has more power, together we level the playing field, right? When we bargain collectively. And that was really her approach to speech, is that this is having free speech is not the final destination of rights, like, oh, we are a free society because we can speak freely. For Flynn and others like her, the ability to speak freely is how we get to a better world, right? It is necessary
Right.
but not sufficient to say we are a free society, because if we can organize and speak, then we can attempt to rectify imbalances of which we see like out of control right now, right? I think Elon Musk is on target to be the first trillionaire. And that, so like, how do you at least try to how do you create conditions where we can even attempt to rectify some of that imbalance? And that's really what Flynn was all about. So she never separated those things out. And then the other thing I would say is, this is an idea that I get from the labor historian Jim Barrett. It's not unique to me, this notion of Americanization from the bottom up. What a great experience it must be to be an immigrant. You're up, it's awful. You're exploited, right? You're exhausted. You feel like your boss thinks you're expendable. But then, you gather with these people in a public park. You stand on a soapbox and you say, I've got something, fellow workers and friends, I've got something to say. And you're with a whole bunch of people who are committed to fighting for your right to say it. And so this is, I think, a great then and now, right?
Right,
The
right, yeah.
struggle is awful in many ways, but it's also a great introduction to democracy because you're not just like thinking about it and talking about it, you're doing it, right? It's not a spectator sport. And isn't that a great way to learn about, the US is to stake your claim to democratic society by doing it. I
And
mean,
the ideals
democracy
of
is
the
something you do.
republic, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, the actual ideals of the republic. There's a great quote from the Patterson strike where she says, we make the flag, we make the dies, right? The only thing we don't do is scab under the flag.
Yeah.
Right. And she's encouraging the workers to continue to come together, but to not neglect the pickets and the roving pickets. I forget
Hmm.
the moving pickets, right? And just making sure that they felt that sense of community, the starting
Right.
with songs, the singing the songs, the having all of this opportunity to understand that they are in community together.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that I try to emphasize in the book that we've kind of lost, people on the left, is this notion that Flynn is of a tradition that really embraces uh, that, we won't scab under the flag, right?
Right.
This isn't part of the Flynn book, but there's that great image from the Lawrence Bread and Roses strike of the woman who wraps herself in the flag on the
Yeah.
picket line and dares the militia to harm her, knowing that they won't harm the flag. And so Flynn is part of this tradition that really embraces the Declaration of Independence as this revolutionary document with such a liberatory potential, right? That we can, this is a document that can inspire struggle. The First Amendment, empowering people to join together for collective action, to advance their interests, and really embracing the revolutionary tradition of the United States. A lot of people now look at it as sort of, oh, those people, they were flawed. They were terribly flawed. And Flynn and others like her would have been the first to admit it, but they gave us tools that we can use. We can almost like flip it against them, right? They gave us tools
Right.
that we can use to our advantage. And Flynn and others like her would never surrender those. They would never say, that's not my flag. That's not, the red flag was theirs, but so is the red, white, and blue flag. Um,
Right. And the moral authority of the people, right,
right,
to say, okay, this is how we want to live. This is how we are going to exercise our rights. And it's our responsibility to
right.
say so, right?
It's
Um,
like, this
it,
land is your land. This land is my land.
yeah. Yeah, I think it's something important that we need to remember and hold on to and not push away from it, right? Because
Right,
the ideals are things that we can aspire to and we continue to aspire to. And it's actually very a lot of the events in the book are quite tragic, right? But it's also very hopeful because you see how many generations of working people have fought to make the United States what it set out to be.
hmm
And they continue to do that.
hmm Yeah. And
Yeah.
yeah,
So, I think about it too, with all the student protests on college campuses and the ways that higher education is coming under attack right now, right? And we need to protect this public good. So we're in the business on university and college campuses, right, of creating an engaged public citizenry. And so in order to do that, we have to have free speech. We have to have the ability to engage our students in learning critical thinking skills and using their critical thinking skills, right? And so, I know a lot of us came back to campus after the student encampments to new free speech policies, right? And so I'm thinking particularly about Missoula, and I think it was Missoula, where they tried to dictate, you can stand on this corner
Yep.
in this back alley, and that's your free speech zone, right? And so now we have free speech zones, and I guess we've had free speech zones on college campuses since the protests in the late 60s, but like they're reinforcing this idea, like, okay, this is where you can stand to have free speech. And it's like, well, is it? Or is it more
Well,
free?
if nobody hears you, that was the Wobblies thing. Like, well, wait a minute. If the job agencies that are tricking people into buying passage to jobs that don't exist out in the woods somewhere, right? If we want to protest them, but we are not allowed to stand on the street in front of where their offices are, how is that the right to protest them? It's the same thing. Yeah, you defang the protest by moving it away from where it should be.
Yeah, I'm thinking about the exploitative employment agencies, right? That were bringing people in under false pretenses, charging
Right.
them, for access to jobs that, like you said, didn't exist.
Didn't exist.
Right.
Yeah.
And so then they're there, and then they find out, oh, I'm here as a strike breaker, or, there is no job.
I
Right.
think if Flynn were around now, she'd be on the side of the students, for sure. She loved to speak at college campuses. And I did a great interview with this guy, Bob Lewis, who was a member of the Young Communist League at Cornell. And no one had ever spoken to him before. He was a man of a certain age by the time I met him, and just told these incredible stories about when Elizabeth Gurley Flynn would come to campus and she would drink them all under the table. They'd all, like you and I, they were, it was way past their bedtime. And she wanted to know what was happening in Ithaca, what was happening on campus, so that she could engage audiences. People who in no way, shape, or form would call themselves a communist used to come just because she was such a great speaker and so interesting and so knowledgeable. And she really had this gift for interacting with audiences and making friends. And um, she would sing Irish Revolutionary songs with them. So she really connected with young people really throughout her life. And I think that she would be really encouraging of students in their efforts to speak about what they consider to be, and what many people consider to be, a terrible situation in the Middle East. I think she'd be standing there with them, defending their right to do that, pushing back against the free speech zone. She'd also be defending faculty members at universities like CUNY. Now they're
Right.
going for the public institutions as well as the more elite, quote unquote, elite private institutions. I think she would very much be in the camp of supporting union organizers, adjunct faculty who are being pushed off campus for exercising their right to speech. Um, I think sadly she would find many of the circumstances that we're confronting today all too familiar.
Yeah, just page after page of, oh yeah, here's another example that I can use. You reminded me too that uh the skillful way that she handled the audience in the Sacco and Vanzetti case, when she had to be really careful, right? And she just slowly brought people in just by giving them the facts of the case. And
And humor too. She had a great
right,
sense of
yeah,
humor.
very jokingly, right?
Yeah,
Great delivery of lines of script from the testimony.
yeah, yeah,
And but also in Harlem, right?
yeah.
Saying, Irish workers, Black workers, how can we come together, and we should unite for these common causes.
That
And
was
just,
one of the,
oh,
oh, I'm
sorry, go
sorry.
ahead.
No, that was one of the things that her role in the free speech fights, and also her careful attention to the struggles of Black workers are things that I thought were missing from earlier accounts. she's going into Harlem in 1919 after the Elaine massacre, where black
Right.
sharecroppers trying to organize. She was going in there, and my Irish Americans are not known for their kind of expansive thinking about race, right? Whether that's true or not, like that's the stereotype. They're law and order types and usually enforcing discipline. But she really used the emigration of her ancestors, forced emigration because of famine, as a point of contact. As she said to Black audiences, you didn't choose to come here, neither did my ancestors, and we together, we really need to unite. And that was a commitment that really, really mattered to her. And even as a Wobbly, and the Wobblies were committed to organizing all workers, but as a communist as well. She was good friends with Claudia Jones, who the Trinidadian born member of the Communist Party. They went to prison together. And I really think that helped to refine her thinking too, about not just race and class, but gender as well. Angela Davis gives her credit for being one of the first white women to recognize the triple jeopardy thesis, right? The idea that Black working class women are exploited as Black workers, but women also as well, right? But she was
Right.
on it
Right.
even in the 19 teens. It wasn't something she came to later in life. And it was rooted in her Irishness. And I think that that's a really important point.
Yeah, yeah, this language doesn't fit for the time period, right? But what she was doing was intersectional organizing, right?
Totally. Always. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And it's just again another great model for how we need to think. If we think about ourselves as activists, right, then the responsibility that we really have to, this is the other thing. I'm sorry, I'm gonna just stop for a second and kind of and go and touch this, because it just sparked a thought in my head about the coalitions that she managed to move within and to build herself, right? Really, and to me, it's really amazing how much, working class, poor, right? But also privileged. And she used her privilege over and over again to protect workers, to protect friends, strangers, right?
Hmm.
And she continued to build across class lines, right? Across political spectrums, and
Yeah.
really just saying, you know what, we need to come together, because together is the only way we're going to be able to win this fight of
She was,
for workers' rights, right?
she was ripping into Mussolini. She was one of the first, I don't know,
Yeah.
maybe the first. Yeah, I wouldn't bet my life, but I'd bet my possessions that she was the first Anglophone anti-fascist. At a time when the only real resistance to fascism was coming from Italian radicals, because their comrades in Italy were getting, tortured and killed. So they saw what Mussolini was about, and Americans saw him, many, not just in the US, people saw Mussolini as this kind of romantic, dashing figure, and she didn't. And because she didn't have friends and family back in Italy who would suffer because she couldn't be deported, as you say, right, she used what we would now say, she used her privilege to speak out. And one of the things I thought was really interesting that she did too was she called out the KKK as a particularly American form of fascism. We're talking about the 1920s here. Like, this is
Right.
not something that people were regularly doing. And she was doing it. And she started an organization during World War I. It was called the Workers' Defense Union, for anyone who was jailed for violating the Espionage Act on account of, labor activism. And she defended anarchists, socialists, communists, syndicalists, trade unionists, just, a broad alliance, including even, this is my favorite one, the New York Vegetarian Society. And when I first saw that on the list, I'm like, what in the hey were the vegetarians doing with the socialists and the anarchists and the pacifists? And then I learned that what would happen is, like, if you were a vegetarian and you protested the war, or you led a strike, right? And because, the industries were booming, but the workers were not seeing that, and you were arrested and indicted and imprisoned, they would try to force feed you meat to make you miserable, to get you to maybe rat on friends, or to just make you miserable. And the Vegetarian Society was not having it. So they were advocating for vegetarian meals, and they were part of the coalition. I thought, this is incredible. I mean, this woman really, before the Popular Front, she created a Popular Front. And
Indeed.
that's a testament, I think, to I don't know, to her abilities, to see beyond, right, what's right in front of her.
Yeah, and she traveled so much,
Yeah.
and you think about, yeah, I was, sometimes you would have a sentence or two in there like, 19 cities, and I was like, wait, but that was like 3 months
Yeah. But then she would get
in
like
the
strep throat.
1920s. Say
Yeah.
again.
Then she'd get like bronchitis or strep throat and I mean, one of the lessons of this is that activist life can be really grueling. Yeah, she was,
Right. Yes.
flat on her back for a while.
Yeah, that period of recovery, when she goes back west to rest,
Mhm.
it's really
Yeah, 10
telling, right?
years.
And when we talk about burnout and all of that, and you see you see it, right?
Yeah.
You know, especially even, not even 20 years old and pregnant in prison, like
Yes, exactly.
fighting
Yeah.
for, prison reform.
Yeah. So from
Yeah.
16 to 64 years old. I mean, when she went to prison, I'm sorry, from 16 to 74 years old. So when she went to prison, 1951, she was 61 years old,
Yeah.
right? So she was fighting the good fight pretty much her whole life.
Yeah. Yeah, there's a question in the chat. Do you mind if I
No, no, yeah.
Yeah, it's just could you speak more about the approach of focusing on safety conditions in specific places and and how that impacted how to organize? Was it about getting support generally, or did it focus on how to find solutions beyond wages and hours if the problems are physical in the environment?
Um, okay, so the the when Flynn was, it's a really good question. I'm just trying to make sure that I do it justice. So when Flynn was doing the bulk of her labor organizing, and leadership of strikes in quotes, because she really worked with people, not, and she wasn't in charge. She was with the IWW, and the IWW, Derek is the person who asked the question. The IWW is a really cool organization, really feisty, really fluid organization, very democratic, but they also never negotiated contracts. So, that you didn't strike for better wages and working conditions and then codify all of that into a collective bargaining agreement and then sign the agreement. First of all, collective bargaining agreement wasn't recognized, right, until the 30s, and this is like the 19 teens. But also the Wobblies, they didn't believe in doing those kinds of things. The idea was it is the struggle, the constant struggle that keeps your boss honest. No contract is ever going to make your boss respect you. Their fear that you're going to strike and take money out of their pockets, or among the more radical among the IWW, or perform acts of sabotage. That's really what your guarantee was. So, so they, advocating for safety conditions very much locally focused, because the union would be locally focused. They would come in, they would, really focus all of their resources on organizing in the silk mills in Paterson, New Jersey, and that was where they were at this time, or on the Iron Range in the Mesabi, Minnesota Iron Range, right? And so all the resources would be focused, and then they would win or lose, and then leave and go on to the next struggle. So, that's one of the criticisms of the IWW, is that just when they created kind of the beginnings of the conditions where they could make an impact on a community locally, they would move on to focus on another community. So even though, she was very locally focused and very much concerned with, not just wages, but working conditions and safety and things like that. And also, by the way, that's why Flynn, like some other socialist women, she was not an advocate for the Equal Rights Amendment, because she and others felt like that would undercut protective legislation for women. Like, wages and hours of special accommodations for pregnant women. So she didn't support ERA because it would have an impact on safety conditions. But that was later. That was, during her communist years of 50s, 60s. In her earlier years, it was a really kind of like going into a place, doing everything you can and then moving on and going somewhere else. So it really didn't have a long-term impact, unfortunately.
But I think, you could make the point, right, that what they were encouraging to do and what I picked up from the book, right, is that Flynn really asked the questions about what was going on, what was happening, and gave the political argument of, you
Mhm.
should have the say in this, and knew everything, right? Knew the local politics, knew who the actors were, and that was clearly through conversations with the workers, and then encouraged the workers to do something about it. So,
Right.
yes, they'd leave, but it was leaving after, doing the political education work to say, okay, get together, organize yourselves, and move as a unit, right, to protect your rights, right? And I think that's what made all of the local conditions really stand out in each of these fights and the way she
Yeah.
positioned them, right? Because, the press would say, oh, outside agitator or whatever, or whatever word they want to use, right? And then they would call her the leader, right? And she, because she's young, she's pretty, here's this young woman out here who's a great speaker, right? She has all of this press appeal, right? But
Yes.
she uses that
Yeah.
not to prescribe solutions, but really to encourage the workers there to, and then just advocate for them, whatever decisions they come to, that's what she would speak for.
Yeah, that's a great point, Naomi. You're right. I think, and so the truth is a combination, right, of that and what I just said, because it's true that although the IWW would leave, the things that they were fighting for made a long-term impact on the industry, on the silk industry in Paterson, on the textile industry in Lawrence and in surrounding areas. You're right. One of my favorite quotes is Flynn saying to the workers in Paterson, um, "I'm the phonograph, you make the record."
Right.
Right. So
Yeah.
what you tell me, what you tell me your needs and interests are, that's what I'm going to advocate for. I can't be blacklisted. I can't be deported. But I'm not your leader. I'm making the wreck. I'm the phonograph. Uh,
Yeah, I mean, there were huge losses, right, in Patterson, right? I
yeah,
think 2,000 workers blacklisted, really hard conditions, but also
improvements.
they didn't have the speed up
Right.
that other places did. They kept the two
Yeah.
looms instead of four, right?
Right.
They had shorter hours, they had more pay. So there were clear victories from that
Right.
approach.
Yeah, yeah. I think definitely. And the IWW was actually trying to thread the needle when we get to World War One to try to be more structured to kind of bridge what you and I just said, right? Some of the problems that arise from leaving, but also, the good work that they were able to do, right? How do you perpetuate that? And then they just got crushed
You're right. Yeah.
during the
Yeah.
war, and we really never saw the fruits of that effort come to pass. Which is sad because it would have been interesting to see what the union could have become.
Yeah,
Um,
it's a good lesson too, right? Because there's so many different approaches and so many different ideas about what we need as a workers' movement today.
right.
Um, and there's something to be said for having a more expansive view. And right, you have your agenda, I have my agenda. We don't actually have to fight each other. If you think about the AFL's collusion, we'll say, with state and local and national governments to crush the IWW. Really,
Yeah, it's kind of sad.
it's very sad, right?
Yeah,
And today more than ever, if we're going to stop fascism, we have to come together across political lines, across ideologies, and work together as people. And I think that that's something that comes through Elizabeth Gurley Flynn's life work that you
yeah.
present in this biography. I'm watching the time, and I see. Did you see the question from Abby in the
Yeah,
chat?
be the spoon lady. I love it. I love that. I'm curious why the spoon lady. But So yeah, so Naomi mentioned something a few minutes ago that I want to amplify too is that when Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, during her wobbly years, when she would show up like in Spokane or Missoula or Patterson for these free speech fights, or in Lawrence for a strike, or the Mesabi Range out in Minnesota for a strike among the iron miners there, she always made the news. I mean, it was like, okay, like here's the most eloquent labor orator east and west of the Mississippi. There's a bunch of quotes in there about people remembered like decades later. I remember the first time I heard you speak. It was incredible. You raised your hand, and I thought, I've never seen a more beautiful hand. The whole package was really appealing. But she was recognized as the leader. The local communities all recognized her as, okay, now they're cooking with gas because Elizabeth Gurley Flynn is here. She was the brain, she was the charisma, she was the moxie behind the whole thing. And one of the things that I really tried to do in the book was to give her credit for the tactics that she did devise for the free speech fights, because there's been a bunch written about the free speech fights, but they really don't recognize her contribution. And I'm not sure if flooding, to your question, if flooding the jails was her idea alone, but the notice, wanted men to fill the jails of Spokane. That happened to call people in for the Spokane free speech fight. But the free speech fight before that in Missoula, that was her idea, to put out a call to say, look, like we're standing on soapboxes here. We're being told we can't speak, and we're just going to keep speaking until they run out of room in the jails for us. So please send reinforcements so that we can do that. And then the Wobblies ran with that. So it looks like that was her idea. If it wasn't, it was certainly hers and somebody else's. Because as far as I can tell, she was the first person to do that. But I mean, maybe she wasn't. I don't know. And then you work with hobos, which is great, by the way. One of my dad's oldest brother was actually my dad was a baby of 9. His oldest brother was a hobo, though not during the free speech fights. One of the things I just want to point out that I also address in the book is a lot of the mythology, and rooted in fact, right? A lot of the lore about hobos is very gendered. Women, there were women hobos, but generally speaking, that experience of like being arrested during the free speech fights and singing in jail and driving, the prison, their jailers crazy. That was the men. There weren't enough women to be imprisoned in a group like that. There weren't facilities to imprison them in a group like that. In fact, the women were treated, they were witnessed a prostitution ring in prison. One of them was raped. One of the wobbly women. It was a very different experience. Flynn actually was mistaken for a prostitute. She was pregnant in jail. While those stories about wobblies are really interesting and certainly key to the free speech fights, again, it was very much the guys who did that. Not only, I mean, there were some women, but it's just much easier to be a guy out riding the rails by yourself, in 1909 than a young woman.
Yeah, you made that very clear in the book, Marianne. Just the isolation of the women who were arrested, and the fact that they didn't have that community of solidarity in the prisons that the men were able to cultivate. And they weren't singing songs to each other and aggravating the jailers, and they really experienced right, that the isolation. And I forget the phrase you use, and so I'll pause here and say I forget the phrase you use, but it's a very clear indication that they were forced to suffer under the system of the jail in ways that the men didn't. But the book is so I love the language, right? It's so accessible, and it's like you're having a conversation sometimes with Flynn, and you kind of not so much like duplicate the style that you described that she uses and in the quotes that you have from the book, but just the fact that you blend in so much of this history, right? This international history in this time frame of her life of activism, right? But you do it in such a way that it just easily pulls folks in. You're like, oh, And this is how you get the ACLU. And oh, this is the origins of this, and this is the origins of
Thank
that.
you. I tried to do that. I didn't want it to be just for wonky academics. Abby, the spoon lady, yes, women passing as men. You'd have to do that to stay safe too, right? In many contexts, I imagine that was, it gave you freedom, but it also um, perhaps was a way to stay safe. It's really interesting. Um, there's a book, I don't, there's a book, it's Heather Meyer, right? Who wrote about women in the IWW. If you're interested, Abby, I would check that out. I believe her last name is Meyer. But she wrote about women in the IWW, like the first full-length study of women, wobblies. And it's good, it's interesting. Do we have any other questions? I don't think so.
So can you see no more questions in the chat? I'll ask one more.
Okay.
About the split from the Wobblies. Can you tell a little bit about what happened with her and Haywood?
I think part of it, I think, so there were a number of things. One was a split over tactics,
Right. Yeah, that's where
right?
my head went. Sorry.
Yeah, so there were some arrests during the Masabi Range strike, and the Haywood disagreed. They were the Flynn and Tresca and some others. They plea bargained, and Haywood, Big Bill Haywood, for people who don't know, William D. Haywood was another legendary figure in the IWW, strike leader and miner. And so they had disagreement about that. They had disagreements about where funds went for fundraising for imprisoned wobblies. And disagreements about whether the union, so Haywood was really in favor of centralizing the union. Flynn was favored more decentralized approach. So they split over that, and a number of personal issues. But even when she was no longer organizing strikes for the IWW, Flynn was still encouraging workers to join the union. I mean, all that work she did in Harlem, she was technically not a wobbly anymore, but she still found that union to be the best vehicle for interracial working class organizing. And, the wobblies were, they did not participate in the political process, right? As syndicalists, they saw that the place to be active is in the workplace, at the point of production, they called it, through unions, right? And Flynn was not, I mean, she wasn't a suffragist. In fact, she says, like, the first time she ever even voted was 1937, when she voted for Fiorello LaGuardia. So she even retained that kind of skepticism about electoral politics that the Wobblies had for a good 20 years after she left the Union, and then joined the Communist Party. And then, of course, as a communist, she was very engaged in electoral. She even ran for office a few times. But most people, I think, remember her as a wobbly, the rebel girl. And that's okay.
Indeed, indeed. Yeah.
Well, as we find ourselves at the top of the hour, I would like to thank both of you for gracing our virtual halls. Anne Trasciatti, congratulations on this important new book. Naomi R. Williams, thank you for doing the honors tonight. You're such a great interviewer, and for also all the great work that you do. It was an honor to have you both with us. And thanks to all of you in the audience for the questions and, for being so engaging. And today's event has been made possible by support from the City Lights Foundation, fostering an active engagement with books and literary culture through our public events, our publishing program, and educational outreach. So long, everyone. Take care, stay strong, and we hope to see you all again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you.